Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Dr. Boensel. And for those of you watching online, thank you for joining us today. I am very excited to be here with Dr. Marc Boensel, who is a musician, performer, teacher, director, and has experienced and done work in music education in a large variety of settings that we're going to talk about today. And I also want to preface this discussion by saying we will only be talking about a fraction of experiences that are had in the world in relation to music and music education. But this is to start having conversation that's maybe just not about the traditional where we automatically think to when we're talking about music education, but how it benefits our communities and our society outside of those regular or normal experiences. And we hope to keep talking about this in a variety of other people's lives and countries and different education systems. So, thank you, Dr. Benzel, for being here. I would like to start by asking you just in your own opinion and your own experiences, what role has music played in your life? And you can go in as much depth as you would like.
Well, and by the way, thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you so much. Um, because I started off on a very musical path from a fairly young age, starting to study music really at about 9 years old, which I know for some that seems late, but for someone growing up in the United States in Southern California, that's about as early as it could happen in those days. Um, and and so it was always a part of everything else I was doing. So when I was in grade school and at the middle school age, even though I was involved in sports and I was involved obviously in taking my classes and doing all my schoolwork, music was this underlying part of that upbringing and part of that education. Into high school, between band and orchestra and choir, and again continuing in athletics, it was always there as an undercurrent. And then deciding to major in it was a bit of a leap because it it is not the easiest path to decide to choose to kind of put your marker down and say, I've enjoyed this. This has been a wonderful vocation, a wonderful part of my upbringing, but I'm going to take the leap to say I'm going to try to make a living at this. So I'm not going to just use it as a vocation, but as a profession. And I don't make a value judgment either way on that one, because I think in many ways the vocational musician is is as much a part of the music world and community as the professionals are. I'd argue even maybe a little bit more so, since there's so many more of them. And particularly if we're talking ultimately here about music education, about the teaching of it, and about that role in so many aspects of society, it's the vocational musician who are the students of music for a lifetime. Many of us in the profession of music, when we finish school, we kind of quit studying it from the perspective of being under someone's wing. We sort of head out on our own, and it's not that we stop learning, but we stop being taught. Does that make sense? So there's a difference between learning and being taught,
And
because
I
the
would agree.
teacher's role is that mentorship role that a lot of professional musicians lose. They don't have that anymore.
Of course. And it's also, you're no longer just learning for yourself. When
Mm.
you're learning at that point for your sharing and for your collaboration with what you're going to do with other people because you're not a musician to be by yourself.
Absolutely true. Absolutely so. So music for me in life, because I was fortunate enough to, and I think we talked about this last time, I said yes to some things along the way in my life, to do some things I'd never tried, and had no idea how to do them in the music world, but did them anyway. It has been, uh, it's been my entire lifetime's work. It's been the way I have made my living my entire life. Doesn't mean I haven't done other things along the way, but it's always been there. What's interesting, or you might find interesting, is that because I have spent my whole life as a musician, You would be surprised how little music I listen to on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
When I drive my car, I don't listen to music. When I'm working in my office, I don't listen to music. Because for me, music doesn't belong in the background. And so I don't treat it that way. I don't use it that way. That surprises people when I tell them that. But I think it's because when I'm involved in it, it is at the forefront of my attention, whether it's teaching it, teaching a music theory class or an oral skills class, or running an ensemble or running a rehearsal, or whether it's singing or playing in an ensemble or a solo or whatever, it's at the forefront. So when I'm not doing those things, if I'm balancing my checkbook, then I don't have music playing because it doesn't belong there for me. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it, it just doesn't work that way for me. So that is one aspect of music in my life that doesn't really exist. I don't listen to it. It's not to say I don't listen to it, and this will probably come up later, but I don't listen to it in the background, really.
So if you're listening to it, you still enjoy live music, right? And that's because that's part of an experience and you're putting your full effort into listening to a concert or to a performance. Or do
Oh,
you
I
still have
absolutely adore. Oh, yes, I absolutely adore listening to music, but not in the context of doing something else.
Okay.
It honestly, for example, when I lived up in the Washington, D.C. area, I used to drive into D.C. to teach at American University. If I had music playing, I would be so distracted by the music, I'd miss my exit. So I realized I just need to listen to podcasts or something. So, because it pulls my attention too much. And so I don't relegate it to the background. What I do instead is try to revel in it wherever I encounter it.
Definitely. So to continue off of that and maybe not just speak for what music is for you, but what your perception would be in a more broad sense, under the belief and principle that both music education and performance hold great importance for all people, disciplines, abilities, cultures, what is its universal purpose? Or how can it be an asset to every person's life?
One of the great mysteries of humanity has always been why art exists. Why do we have this creative impulse? So depending on your cultural perspective, depending on belief systems that you might have in your own life, it still dredges up the question why we have this creative impulse. For us, thankfully, we don't have to answer that question. We have to acknowledge the reality that we have it. One of the things that is most tragic is when there is not a musical or artistic outlet for people in a particular setting. Later in life, they can often discover that this was something that they really wish that they had had the opportunity to experience. And this is why I think it's so universally vital, because every human, I mean, it's remarkable how every human being in every culture has a musical component to it. So every culture has music. There is not one nation or tribe or subculture or isolated entity that does not have some way in which they express themselves through the production of sound. The human voice being, of course, the first one. But it's a remarkable thing because in the rest of the world, sound has a very specific practical purpose. To produce it for this esoteric and ethereal purpose is rather remarkable, but it's completely permeates our whole society. All societies, all cultures have it. That in and of itself shows how valuable it is to us. And now, if something is that particularly valuable to us, to intentionally or accidentally remove it from any part of a culture is leaving us space that isn't being filled by something else. So because we have this creative impulse, I think we have a responsibility to nurture it in others. particularly because to not do so leaves a void. And it's really an injustice to leave that void in any person's life. And it could just be a matter of well, and so that circles around to the gaps in music education are caused, I think, when there isn't the word I'm looking for, there isn't a concerted effort to make it comprehensive. So, for example, I've encountered way too many students along the way who've come up through a particular middle school and high school music program, and maybe they're a singer, and they'll sing a beautiful, beautiful aria for an audition. And then I will refer them to the printed piece of music that they just sang, and they won't recognize on the page that that's what they just sang. And so there's this gap in them understanding what it's made of and how it's put together and what it does. And this is true at any level. So, there is a reason why in most public school systems throughout the United States, now I don't know about the rest of the world, and I suspect this is quite true in Europe, but I don't know about Asia or Latin America or Africa, but certainly in Europe and in the United States, music is considered part of the general education curriculum in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, and in college. All colleges and universities in the US have fine arts as part of the core curriculum. There's a reason for that. Because we have this creative impulse, that is considered an essential component of our education, to explore that. The purpose of art clearly is in and of itself to express something. It is a communication device. What's particularly remarkable about music is that it is actually, if you think about the other art forms like painting and sculpture and things like that, those are representations of something real. A painting of a meadow is not a meadow, but a piece of music is an actual entity unto itself. And that's a little bit more unique in that art form in that regard. Perhaps that's why music, unlike other art forms, seems to touch every culture, because it seems to touch something very core for us.
Yes.
And if it's not in our education, I think it leaves a hole, it leaves a space.
Yes. I think that music, because it is so permeating, like you said, in every aspect of a culture and society, it's possible to be exposed to it without it being part of education. But when you don't have the education to support those lived experiences, they aren't as enriching. And
For sure. And I think also you have a more narrow perspective that way.
yes,
Because you listen to that one radio station every
yes,
day. You think that's what music is, and you're missing out on so much more. And you use the word culture there, and I think that's a huge and important component as well, because our arts define our culture. They are what make us have a cultural identity. So we can have a group of people in a given city, for example. Take where we live here in Columbus. We would be hard pressed to take a large cross section of our city, sit them down in a room, and check off a long list of things that we all agree on. Right? We would probably be discovering that we have an awful lot of things that we see very differently. But the one thing that we would, I think, all agree on is that we love the fact that in this city, we have an arts community. That is something that unifies all of us, because it is our culture. It's something that we can all claim.
yes,
But that comes from it being taught from an early age. If young children are not exposed to the arts, they're not going to join that culture later. They're not going to be part of it. And that raises, of course, the whole issue of making the arts accessible to everyone.
Yes.
And I think that starts in the classroom,
Yes.
because there is where everyone learns math and everyone learns science and everyone learns language. And there's the opportunity for us to all be exposed to the arts in an educational way, where we don't just have it in the background and have it passively, but actually understand what it is and what it does and
Yes.
how it's created.
Yes.
I think the most valuable college class that we teach is music appreciation for the non-majors. That if a music department in a college doesn't teach that, I don't think they're doing their jobs. For example, and along the same lines, a college or university music program that doesn't have ensembles available to the general population that are only for their majors, I think is not doing its full job either. Um, yes, you have to have the high level ensembles for your majors, but for example, let's take bands, for example. Yes, you need a top wind ensemble in every university, but I think you also need a community band.
Yes.
I think you need a community chorus and a highly refined chamber choir. I think you need both, because you're educating the population around you to appreciate the art you're trying to create.
Yes. That was a strength of my undergrad program, that they had the capacity to have so many non-major music ensembles.
Mm-hmm.
And not only did it enrich the overall university community because of that, but other music students were able to have more experiences. I played cello in a non-major orchestra, and I conducted one of the bands, and I wouldn't have had those opportunities even as a
Mm-mm.
music major without those sorts of settings. So I have great
Absolutely.
appreciation for those, and I've played with community orchestras just as substituting, nothing long term. But the environment of those ensembles is so different than
Oh yeah.
conservatory or professional groups, because there is something about it being a community, and those people being part of a community and wanting to give back to their community and not just going through the motions.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
unfortunate sometimes when high level ensembles turn into that, because they're not living up to their potential if they fall into those sorts of attitudes. But just to say, my experience with community orchestras has been just as enriching as my experiences playing with the most advanced ensembles I've been a part of, for
I
different
think,
reasons.
and I think the other aspect of that is the multi-generational connectivity of those things.
Yes.
When I think about, for example, my church choir at St. Luke, I have 19-year-olds to 85-year-olds in that ensemble. And that intergenerational connection is super vital. And we lose that if we isolate ourselves in an ivory tower in academia, I think.
Yes, definitely. And I will go on in just a moment, but I wanted to acknowledge that one of the things that's difficult talking about music education also is that what we want in an ideal world is equitable access, and that's something that has never been true, and it's not something that is a reality right now. There are many students, there are many populations that are excluded from music, specifically classical music, and there's a lot of things that have to be done collectively in order to change that. And I hope in my lifetime that there is a change, and I hope that I can see it happening around me, and also that our organization is doing our part to make things more accessible. And that's one of our goals, is to have things that don't have barriers for students to learn as much as possible in whatever capacity we can. And so when there are opportunities for that, no matter what the setting, I think that it's extremely important to be more inclusive in music education. Of course, it's a part of public school curriculum, but it's it's not the same at every school in every city. And that's not to say standardizing something is the answer, because I actually think that's the wrong direction to go. Also, you need to be responsive and you need to be thoughtful in your teaching and practices, but it's something that we have to be proactive about, so
I
that
think
more
it's
people can understand how great music is, and it will be that much greater when it is for everyone always.
I think one of the things that we miss when we have an imbalance in what kinds of programs are available, for example, in public school education, depending on what district you're in or what school you go to, is that we isolate students from opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
and we isolate them from a more comprehensive education if those things don't exist at every school. And the thing that I find strange to me is that, so for example, I think I've told you before, I spent, over 20 years in the Navy, in the US Navy, and in the music program. One of the things that the Navy does is people are always being transferred and rotated to different ships, to different bases, to different stations. That's true even in the music program. You do 3 or 4 years at a particular Navy band, and then everybody's rotating, and some people go to this one, some people go to that one, some people go over here. The idea is that you are constantly mixing and stirring and bringing together the varied abilities and skill sets of the people you have into these different combinations all the time, so that ultimately you are diffusing or spreading the collective skill sets of all the folks involved through the whole program, so that one Navy band, for example, isn't any better than any other because it has more of the better players or whatever. That is this constant stirring of the mix. That seems to me that could work in a public school district. Why on earth would one high school have all the string instruments and this other one have none? Couldn't these things be stirred and mixed among all of the schools? To me, that seems like it wouldn't be that big of a leap. Um, maybe the solution ultimately is less compartmentalization.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, each high school has a music program, right? Each middle school has a music program. Maybe our districts need to have music programs.
Yeah.
And everyone who lives in this city, for example, every child who grows up in this city and goes to a public school in the city has the same access to the same music teachers, to the same art teachers, to the same math teachers, to the same English teachers, because it is in a constant state of being stirred and rotated and moved, so that it's not, oh, the kids at that school get to do this, but the ones over here, well, they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought.
Yes, and resources is a big part of it. That can be human resources or equipment or even knowledge. Um, but I think the more powerful part could be a shift in attitude too, because it's very easy to diagnose a certain school as not being worthy of a certain type of music education. And that's something that comes at face value of knowing a school or knowing a community. And I think that it happens in a cycle, but it's something that is hard to for a school to move away from its reputation also. And that's why I like being so surrounded by young people that are fresh and seeing issues. It's not like the issues haven't been there before, but
Mm-hmm.
when you realize it for the first time, it makes a fire in you that's different than if you've been seeing it for 30 years. And I think that there can be a really big change also to access when more people can have a shift in how they view schools and how they view the humans who go to those schools too, no
Absolutely.
matter what those students are reflecting in your eyes or in my eyes or in their teacher's eyes. So yes, that's along my same hope that in my lifetime, I hope that there is a change and I see more students have more opportunities. And it's not going to just happen. It's it's not going to just happen even if things in the world change or things in the government change. It has to be people being active in their own communities all the time.
Definitely. It takes a mindset change.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I would like to move a little bit into what your individual experiences have been. I would say that different circumstances allow different functions of music and music education. And I would like to know, on the positive side, what are the strengths of these different things? So we'll start with church. How is the purpose of music elevated in a church setting? Or how might it be unique in comparison to what you can do in other groups or ensembles?
Well, one of the things about church music is that its purpose is much different than it is in the secular world. So, music in the concert hall has the purpose of being the musical outlet, yes, for the performers, but it is there for the enjoyment and edification of the audience. It exists as a collaboration between performer and audience. In the church setting, in any spiritual setting, the audience shifts. So for people who go to churches, people who attend church, Christians specifically, have always believed that their music making is not for the entertainment of the audience, that God is the audience, and that music is a vehicle through which God speaks to the people. It elevates, for example, in vocal music. One of the things that is most compelling about vocal music in the church is that you can read the words from a particular piece of music and they have an impact on the listener.
Mm-hmm.
When music is created for those words, and this is the most important part, and that music conveys not just the literal words themselves, because any notes can convey words, but also conveys the deeper meaning, the feeling, the the next level of understanding. So we read Psalm 23, for example. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want." Okay. But if you set that to music, and that music is conveying a feeling of space and openness and a meadow and an open sky, because there's space in the music and sound and time to revel in what these words really mean. And maybe that's probably one of the bigger components, is that it allows for more time for the listener to more fully ingest meaning of words. So music in that setting goes beyond entertaining the listener and has an opportunity to spiritually uplift the listener. I think also, and it's a personal belief of mine, but I believe that music in the church reveals to us all something more about the nature of God. So, uh, in the Middle Ages, it was a belief that those early Gregorian chants were divinely inspired. And so there was a necessity to preserve them as they were originally created. But one of the reasons for that was because it was believed that they were constructed in such a way that they could bring the congregation closer to God. They could bridge the gap. What we've discovered since then are some fascinating things about vibration and about the way everything in the universe has a pitch.
Mm-hmm.
And our music system, surprisingly enough, has some of these same vibrational properties as the way many other things in the world, and indeed in the whole solar system and in the galaxy, interact with each other. There is something beyond just the superficial in that experience of producing music for this more lofty purpose. It's very intangible and it's hard to pin down in many ways, but it's most evident to me that where we run into a problem in the church when it comes to music, and this is actually something that's going on now, is this rather strong debate as far as the role of music in the church. And for some, they very much appreciate that the music seems to do something for them. But that, to others, distorts its purpose, which is it is supposed to have a loftier purpose than that. And that, again, circles back to education. We'd have to teach in the church what music's role is and how their participation in it is so vital. And that is something that I strive to do as a church musician. So I have been working as a church musician for nigh over 30 years now, mostly directing choirs and instrumental ensembles as the conductor, but also doing a good bit of singing and playing myself. And a lot of what I have tried to do is to first educate the participants as to the purpose of music, and then have that spread into the education of the whole congregation, that their participation in the music is vital to its true purpose being realized, which is the idea that God is the audience, not people. That gets lost when it looks and feels more like a concert than it does a church. That's a big debate. That's one that I'm embroiled in now quite a bit. And that, I think, requires a good bit of education, and I work on that quite a bit.
Yes, I appreciate hearing your perspective and knowing how important it is for you to be engaged with your church members about the purpose of music. I think no matter what church you go to, you'll get a slightly different answer to the question, what's the function of music? Because it does change. And maybe the biggest dichotomy would be more traditional liturgical music versus contemporary or more progressive churches. But then within those, there are many, many different paths as for what a congregation or leadership deems is the purpose for music. So I think that's also something that changes depending on the community. And it doesn't mean that in that case there are right or wrong, maybe some more right than others, but it definitely is not always the same.
Yeah, and I think it circles back around to the whole public school music education, because as people come up, if they haven't been exposed to more music than just one kind or one particular genre, then they're not open to the possibilities that are presented by all these other things.
Yes, definitely. So to speak about schools, and you can talk about elementary, middle, high school, youth orchestras, or college level academics, what is the purpose of music there?
It provides a couple of different avenues. So I was a high school teacher for a couple of years, and I've been teaching at the college and university level for coming up on 14 years now, full-time and part-time. It has first of all, it has a basic component in education, particularly at the elementary, the middle, and the high school level, in many of the same ways that athletics do. One of the things that we struggle with as a society is, how do we work together? How do people from divergent backgrounds, economically, culturally, language barriers, all the different things that divide us, we can work around when we have a common goal, when we have a common perspective on what has to be accomplished. And one of the great things that music education does, starting in elementary school and into middle school and high school, is it creates a subculture within that school in which people from every background you can think of come together with a common goal. This is an incredibly valuable life lesson for later in life. Can you imagine what we could do as a society, whether we're talking city, state, country, the world, if we have a common goal, if we have something that we all believe we need to accomplish? This teaches us that on a micro level. And I believe, later in life, shows us how to be open to that possibility. So, for example, we'll take a high school music program, for example. Now, not every student in the high school joins the orchestra or the choir or the band. Mm-hmm. But those who choose to become part of a culture that has a common goal. Mm-hmm. Those folks later in life, these studies have already been done, those folks later in life tend to ultimately have more upward mobility in their career path, whatever that career path is. They tend to have higher incomes. They tend to live longer. They tend to have lower incidence of mental illness and other kinds of emotional disabilities later in life. And in fact, folks who participate in music through a lifetime have a 90% lower incidence of diseases like Alzheimer's. So there are incredible benefits to it. Mm-hmm. And they start at that early age. So when I was a high school teacher, we had a school of about 1,000 students, and I had probably 100 of them in the music program. So a nice 10% cross section of that class or of that school. Mm-hmm. No other entity in that school, I believe, could teach cooperation better other than maybe a football team. And you might be surprised to hear that from a musician, but athletics and music do this beautifully. The other thing that they do is there's a purity about them. And this is something that is very vital in education. And what I mean by a purity is when I'm the band director at high school X, and I am seating the students in the flute section, principal, second chair, and on down. Well, who do I put in the principal chair? The best flute player. Not the one that looks like me, not the one that talks like me, not the one that is skinnier or heavier or taller or blonde or brunette or male or female. No, I put the best flute player. If I'm the coach of the football team at high school B, who's the quarterback? The best player in that position. And that's what I mean by a purity. It becomes merit-based. And this is something extremely vital for all people to learn, that if you can create a culture wherever you go and whatever you're doing and whatever your career path is, when you have the opportunity to influence the creation of a subculture, whether it's an office, a classroom, whatever it is, if you have learned the benefits of a merit-based system and you carry that forward, our whole society benefits from that down the road. Because the more of our society that is merit-based, that kind of purity, which you find in the arts and in athletics more than anywhere else, that's why those things are so vital to education, because they teach us to value the part that matters the most, which is not the outside, not what we look like, not how old we are or young we are, or any of those nonsense things, but who we are becomes the value. Yeah. So I think there is where music plays such a vital role in education, because it creates within the larger institution of an educational institution these merit-based subcultures that are incredibly valuable to teaching young people to bring that forward in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I really like what you say about having a common goal, and even if students aren't aware of that's something that they're learning, of course, that's something they're benefiting from, and maybe it's something they realize much later, and maybe they never realize it. But when a teacher can successfully facilitate that, that is a great thing, for sure. In the same realm, possibly, how would you say that the purpose of music is most elevated in community organizations? Those could be ensembles, or they could be social programs focused on performing or on education.
The great thing about community-based music making and why it's so vital is because well, there's several things. One of the things we talked about was the intergenerational connection. One of the things that you don't get in academia is that kind of intergenerational connectivity. So in an education setting, in a high school or a college, Everybody participating is around the same age
Hmm.
and has about the same experience level, other than the teacher.
Hmm. And they come from the same place.
Pretty much live in the same neighborhood for the most part. I mean, unless you have a magnet school. Now,
Hmm.
at the university level, that's different because, one of the things there is you've got people from all over the world and they come together, but they're all about the same age.
Hmm.
So this generational connectivity is not a part really so much of the educational experience in academia, but it is throughout community-based institutes. So church choirs, community orchestras, those kinds of things, um, they are first and foremost by their very nature intergenerational.
Hmm.
And they're the kind of education you get from sitting next to somebody 30 years older than you, but doing the same thing that they're doing is remarkable.
Hmm.
And it's not just the 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 learning the instrument or singing that same piece together. It's honestly, it's what happens during that 10-minute break in the middle of the rehearsal, where the 24-year-old gets to talk to the 60-year-old, and they have completely different lives outside of that experience. But there, you're able to feel a connection. For the younger person, you have this connection to the past. For the older person, you have this connection to the future. And there, it spreads into every aspect of their lives, because at some point, you're going to know something more about the person next to you.
Hmm.
Oh, they work at Starbucks. Oh, I've been to that Starbucks. Oh, this lady was a payroll clerk in an office 25 years ago. What was that like? What was it like to be in that industry? What did that, all of those little learning opportunities about the past and about the future are present in that. And music is the vehicle through which that happens.
Hmm.
And so that is why, so you don't just learn about music in a community orchestra or a community chorus or a church choir, those kinds of things. You learn about life in those settings. And it benefits both directions. One of the things that when I was in Albany, Georgia, before moving here, and also in Annapolis, Maryland, before moving to Albany, is in both of those college settings, we also had community ensembles. We had community choruses, community bands, community orchestras. And one of the things that I absolutely loved the most was to see in the break, in the middle of the rehearsal, the young people and the older people didn't drift apart. They stayed and talked to each other, or they would sit and play some duets together, or they would, and you would see the older folks become younger, and you would see those younger folks begin to appreciate what the previous generation had done and how hard they've worked their whole lives, and begin to realize that their future includes many of these wonderful things that these folks have already done, and it gives them a perspective on their future as well. It's a wonderful, and it was music that created that opportunity. If that's missing from your community, you're missing out on one of the rare opportunities for intergenerational connectivity. Because where else is that going to happen? It's not going to happen at school. It's not going to happen probably at work. Um, but there is a place where it can, and music is the vehicle through which that happens.
Yes, I hear you. And what I love beyond that too is the opportunity for music to be enriching as something that's living and not something that you're trying to arrange into a final product. And my my favorite teaching experience that I have the opportunity to have a position in now is teaching a class of kids who are third to fifth grade violin. And yes, we're learning to play violin, but that's not why we're having violin class. We are having opportunities to learn about creating also. improvising, composing, other aspects of music, that when you're in an ensemble that has to have the goal of performing, not that performing is a bad thing, a bad word, it can be restrictive. That's all. It's that there are so many more opportunities and reasons to embrace music that you can see in these sorts of ensembles too. And I think the same can be said for community groups, because they don't have necessarily um, things to fulfill in their music or in their programs, and it creates an environment which can be a more holistic and a more lived experience, not just like a checklist. And that's what personally I have found in the community orchestras that I've been briefly in and out of. And it's because the attitude of the people around me who have been in those groups for a long time, it rubs off on you, even if you're only there for a short time. So I would say I also try to find as many opportunities as possible in the different sorts of settings that I'm in to make music more of a whole thing. It doesn't just have one side. And it can be hard to get away from that mindset if you're in music school like me, being a student, where everything is focused about music and music in very specific light. And for me, that's not what I want for my own experiences, and it's definitely not what I want for my students and the people that I will have the opportunity to be around too. So I love hearing about those cases of intergenerational exchange, because I don't see a place in my life that I have that right now. And now I feel like I'm missing something hearing you talk about that. So it's a good thing to highlight and bring up.
Something
Now,
good to try to find.
yes, of course. On the other hand, do any of these previous settings, the church or other religious organizations, education, or community programs, have um, any non-changeable or just so traditional it's the norm aspects that detract from music making or learning in some way? And how could we do better, if you had wise words to empower us to be better?
It is perhaps by default a tradition based way of doing things. Um, in the church, you always say, well, up there's the choir, there's the organ, back out here is the congregation, and you have your role, and you have your role, and you have your role. In the community based ensembles, there is this, well, we do 4 concerts a year, and they're always at the high school auditorium. Um, in education itself, it's we get ready for festival, we get ready for
Yes.
large group performance evaluation, and then for band in the fall, it's marching band, and we always learn a halftime show, and there are some things that are cyclical, and they're built in, and they have been done this way for generations, and it can be very difficult to push people outside of those zones because they're very comfortable with them.
Yeah.
For example, we're coming up, April 4th is Easter.
Mm-hmm.
Every church that has a choir and a pipe organ has had brass instruments on Easter since the 1700s. And if you try to put a string quartet in that sanctuary on Easter Sunday, you will cause an insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
But we miss the opportunity to make some beautiful music in a different way when we do that, when we follow that tradition. Not that that doesn't sound fabulous to have brass and organ and choir, it's glorious. But does it have to be every year? Is it possible that we could do some music that brings a different perspective on this celebration of the resurrection once every 10 years? I think we could,
Mhm.
but you have to be willing to push people out of their comfort zone a little bit to do that. In a community setting, like a community orchestra or a community chorus, um, would it be completely inconceivable to get the high school teachers in the area to handpick 5 students from their ensembles and have a side-by-side concert with your senior citizens and their students, and yet to try to get the high school teachers to think outside of their routine of what they always do every school year and get those community based on, or even, dare I even suggest this, the professional orchestra in your city invite high school students to come in and sit and play with them on a concert
Mhm.
once a year, to get those teachers to break out of their mold and to get that professional ensemble to break out of their mold and try to do something that neither one ever does during their regular season.
Mhm.
Very difficult to do, but a missed opportunity if you
Yeah.
don't try. Um, the the folks who get to do something new are the ones who are willing to break those tradition molds, to break those things open. Um, you know, when I first started in church music many, many years ago, one of the things that I was told was the church is never used for anything other than a worship service, the sanctuary itself. It must never be used for anything else. Well, after a few years of that, I realized, wouldn't this be a beautiful space for chamber music? Well, we don't do chamber music in the church. Chamber music's concert music. We don't do concerts in this building.
Mhm.
But I was able to convince a church to let me try, and that ended up being a wonderful vehicle for bringing more people actually to that institution and seeing it as more than just a place you go on Sunday morning, that it's a place where you can connect in your life more than that. But that took frankly, breaking some pretty big rules
Mhm.
and then kind of asking for forgiveness later. But when they saw that it was a good thing, then it was a good thing,
Yes.
you know? So in any setting, I think if you find yourself, who was it? It might have been Mark Twain, but don't pin me down to it. But someone once said that if you find yourself doing the same thing over and over again, it's time to reform.
Mhm.
Um, it might be necessary for some of us, whatever generation we're in, to be a little bolder in suggesting that we don't do this every year, but let's try something just once a
Mhm.
little bit different. I've done that quite a bit. I've gotten in trouble for it, but I've also created some pretty neat stuff out of that too.
Yes.
Um, and I'm going to keep doing it because I like it.
Yes.
It's a
Tradition is so powerful and dangerous and beautiful. And what's scary about innovation to me, and maybe this would resonate with other people too, is that innovation doesn't always work and it's actually not always the right difference. But if you don't try, you are missing an opportunity. And if you know what your core values are, or if you're working on behalf of a church and you know what the core values of that church is, or of a school or an educational organization, and you operate under that mission, there's a big possibility for success. And you do be bold and be wise and try again if it doesn't work. Just because something out of tradition doesn't work doesn't mean that there isn't another possibility too.
Well, and I tell people all the time in my organizations, we're going to try something, and I'll be the
Yes.
first one to admit if it doesn't work, and I'll go back to what does. I will admit when I'm wrong. One of the things, two things. One, when you do try to do things differently, accept the possibility that the traditional way was actually the better way. It's okay to go back. The other thing is, don't make change for the sake of change, because
Yeah.
change isn't in and of itself good or bad. If
Mm-hmm.
you're going to make change, make good change.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just change for the
Yeah.
sake of change, because some things are good.
Yeah.
Don't, there's an old saying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It
Mm-hmm.
means, yes, you change the water, but you don't hurt the baby in the meantime. So it is a balance, and it's not about caution, because I don't think caution is the right word. It's about being deliberate,
Hmm.
and it's about being sincere, and it's about knowing who you are and where you are and who you're working with.
Hmm.
And as a leader, one of the things you do is you steer, but you don't push.
Hmm.
You steer, you don't shove people in the direction that you want them to go. You show them which direction to go.
Yes, definitely. So, to close, where would you like to see a greater appreciation or a deepened understanding of music in your world?
It would be, I would love to see a greater variety of music appreciated in our culture. I would love for us to go back to a time when the musicians were the ones who made the music and led the way and taught everyone else how it works. We've lost that, in that now the musician is in the background,
Hmm.
and the non-musician, the audience, is
Yeah.
making all of the decisions now.
Hmm.
A better educated audience could help with that. But and one of the things I think that would help with that is if we have more comprehensive music education in our schools, all the way from elementary through college. Then when you have something like a street fair, you don't just have one genre of music playing. You can have three or four different kinds. You can have a string quartet at one end of the street and a bluegrass band at the other end of the street, and not just the bluegrass band or not just the string quartet. I would love to see a society, a community that has been educated well enough in music that they can appreciate every different genre
Hmm.
and include it in that way. It can be included in so many different aspects of our daily lives. So that, in other words, the I love the concert hall, but the orchestra doesn't have to just play in the concert hall. It could play in the church. The
Hmm.
choir doesn't have to just sing in the church. It could sing in the bandstand in the park. The band doesn't just have to be out on the football field. The band could be in the concert hall.
Hmm.
All these different things could be in all these different places. Now, that takes being willing to break with tradition, and it takes having a community that's educated enough in the art of music to appreciate that it can be in these different aspects of their lives.
Yes.
So that's a long-term goal, is
Hmm.
to educate our community and our culture enough to realize that, yes, music is actually a part of their culture, not just in the background.
Hmm.
But then understand that it's all these different kinds, all these different genres, and all these different styles can all be a part of the tapestry, the mosaic of our culture. And that it's not, well, I only like this, so that's all I will listen to. Well, that only comes because that you were taught that, or you wouldn't think that way. So let's instead teach this next generation that all of this music is art, and all of this music can be a part of their lives, and thus a part of their culture. That would be a long-term goal of mine.
Yes, that's beautiful. And that also means that I think you need more well equipped musician leaders, because leadership is not a part of what we maybe formally learn in music school or even in school leading up to college. Um, might be something you learn through extracurriculars or through music, but it can be very empowering to be so involved with music. And I think we can harness more of that power when we become more educated on how to be good leaders too, because then we can lead other musicians, we can lead audiences, and we can affect change in those ways. But it's both. It's the people, the common population, and it's the musicians both having a shift, I think.
And one of the things that is probably the hardest for leaders to do is to nurture and mentor new leaders, because we like to be in charge and we like to be the one who makes the decisions. But I think as educators, if we can commit to teaching others how to lead, that's something that I think is going to be valuable to us all. It's hard. It's hard to mentor new leaders, because you have to hand over the reins to let them lead. One of the things you can't learn in the classroom is how to lead others. You've got to be allowed to get up front and do it. So in education, I think we've got to put a bigger emphasis on the mentorship of future leaders. That's a huge thing. Absolutely.
Yes, let's do it.
I'm in. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Boensel, very much for your time. We appreciate the gift that is your sharing of your experiences and your knowledge. And on behalf of our organization, we're very, very grateful for your time and willingness to support us in this way too. So thank you for being here. Thank you to our audience online, and take care.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.